My name is Carolyn Campbell, and 3 months ago I had everything a woman in her early 30s could want. A husband who kissed me goodbye every morning, a senior analyst position at a respected marketing firm, a beautiful colonial house in the suburbs with a garden I actually maintained, friends who showed up for wine nights and remembered my birthday. Today I'm staring at an eviction notice taped to the door of room 22 at the Riverside Motel, a place that charges $85 by the week and smells like broken dreams mixed with industrial cleaner. My hands are shaking as I read the notice for the third time, trying to understand how my life collapsed so completely in less than 90 days. But what David and his sister Rebecca don't know, what they couldn't possibly know, is that my Aunt Margaret had been watching everything. And the dusty box I found under my motel bed this morning contains $90,000 in cash, a plane ticket to Dublin departing in 72 hours, and a note written in her precise handwriting that says, "This is just emergency money. The real fortune is waiting where your mother's truth is buried." Let me tell you how 32 years of carefully constructed lies taught me exactly who to trust when everything falls apart. I was born Carolyn Brennan, daughter of Eleanor Campbell, and granddaughter of Irish immigrants who came to America with nothing but determination and thick accents. My mother raised me alone after my father left when I was 3, and she worked her way up from administrative assistant to compliance officer at Westbridge Capital, one of the largest investment firms in the Northeast. She was brilliant with numbers, meticulous about details, and absolutely committed to doing the right thing even when it was inconvenient. Those qualities eventually got her killed, though I didn't understand that until I found Aunt Margaret's box under my motel bed. My Aunt Margaret was my mother's older sister, and everyone in the family described her as difficult. She'd been a forensic accountant for 23 years before retiring early at 52, and she spent her later years investigating corporate corruption and handing out pamphlets at family gatherings about financial fraud schemes. She warned about trusting people with perfect smiles and convenient explanations. She kept files on everything, color-coded and cross-referenced like she was building legal cases instead of just living her life. When she died 8 months ago at 67, alone in her cluttered house surrounded by filing cabinets and old newspapers, everyone said it was sad, but not surprising. She'd isolated herself with conspiracy theories and paranoid warnings. At her funeral, I remember thinking I should have visited more, should have taken her seriously instead of dismissing her concerns as eccentricity. I had no idea she'd spent the last 7 years of her life building a case that would eventually save mine. My mother, Eleanor, died 7 years ago in what everyone called a tragic sailing accident. She'd taken her small boat out alone on a calm evening, and they found her body 3 days later, washed up on a beach 20 miles down the coast. The official report said she'd fallen overboard, possibly hit her head and drowned. It was ruled accidental death. Aunt Margaret stood at the funeral and pulled me aside during the reception. Her grip on my arm was urgent, almost painful. "Your mother was investigating fraud at Westbridge Capital," she whispered. "Major fraud involving pension funds totaling $47 million. Her death is too convenient, Carolyn. The timing doesn't make sense. You need to be careful about who you trust." I dismissed it as grief, twisting into paranoia. Everyone had assured me that Margaret saw conspiracies everywhere, that she'd been this way for decades, that we all learned to nod politely and change the subject. I hugged her and told her I understood she was processing loss in her own way, and I went back to my life thinking I'd done the compassionate thing by not arguing with a grieving woman. Now I understand she was the only person telling me the truth. 2 weeks after my mother's funeral, I met David Campbell at an industry marketing conference in Boston. He was charming in a way that felt effortless, asking questions about my work and actually listening to the answers. He made jokes that were clever without being mean. He offered to carry my materials when we left a session at the same time, and he asked for my number while we waited for different taxis outside the convention center. I gave him my number while trying not to appear too eager, and he called me 3 days later to ask if I wanted to have dinner that weekend. Our courtship felt natural and easy, like we'd been designed to fit together. Dinners at nice restaurants, walks through the city, lazy Sunday mornings reading newspapers in bed. He proposed after 18 months getting down on one knee in the park where we'd had our third date. I said yes without hesitation because I couldn't imagine a reason to say no. He seemed perfect, attentive, successful, exactly what I thought I deserved after the grief of losing my mother. Now, sitting on the sagging motel bed with Aunt Margaret's box open in front of me, I let myself feel something I'd been pushing down for 3 months. Pure, overwhelming terror. What if I was wrong? What if Margaret really had been paranoid? What if this box full of cash and cryptic notes was just the final delusion of a woman who'd spent too many years seeing conspiracies and coincidences? I looked around room 22, stained carpet, peeling wallpaper, a bathroom with a lock that didn't work. 3 months ago, I'd been sleeping in 800 thread count sheets. Now I was 1 week away from sleeping in my car. What if running to Dublin with Margaret's money was just trading one disaster for another? What if I was about to abandon the last shred of my old life based on the fantasies of a dead woman everyone said was crazy? Then I picked up the second item in Margaret's box, a manila envelope I'd been too scared to open. Inside were photographs, dozens of them. David and Rebecca at what looked like a strategy meeting, documents spread across a table. My mother's boat zoomed in on a detail I'd never noticed, a rope that looked cut, not frayed. Bank statements showing wire transfers from Westbridge Capital to accounts in David's name, dated 3 months before my mother's death. And a photocopy of David's real driver's license, not the one he'd shown me. His name wasn't David Campbell. It was David Brennan, my father's younger brother. The uncle I'd never met because he'd allegedly disappeared to Australia when I was a baby. My hands stopped shaking. The terror crystallized into something harder, colder, more focused. Margaret hadn't been paranoid. She'd been right about everything. My entire marriage had been an assignment. David hadn't fallen in love with me at a conference. He'd been hunting me since the day my mother started investigating fraud at Westbridge Capital. And his sister Rebecca, the woman I'd thought was just David's business partner, the woman who'd smiled at our wedding and hugged me at Christmas, was the same Rebecca Brennan who worked in Westbridge's pension fund department. The same Rebecca who'd co-signed the documents my mother had been investigating when she died. I opened Margaret's note again and read the full message. The emergency money is for running. The real fortune is in safety deposit box 847 at First National Bank of Dublin, under your mother's maiden name O'Sullivan. Inside, you'll find 7 years of evidence, enough to destroy Westbridge Capital and everyone connected to the pension fund fraud. They've been waiting for you to find it, Carolyn. That's why they married you, to control you, to watch you, to make sure you never followed your mother's trail. They thought making you poor and desperate would force you to give up. They were wrong. Run now, fight later, and remember, being underestimated is the most powerful weapon you'll ever have. I stood up, repacked Margaret's box, and walked out of room 22 for the last time. I had 72 hours until my flight to Dublin. I had $90,000 in cash. I had 7 years of evidence waiting in a safety deposit box my dead mother had prepared for me, and I had 2 people who thought they'd destroyed me completely, who thought I was broken and defeated, who had no idea that the woman they'd systematically dismantled was about to dismantle them right back. If this story hits home, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Every betrayal I share comes with a twist you won't see coming. David and I married 5 years ago in a ceremony that felt like something out of a magazine. White dress, string quartet, 200 guests who all seemed genuinely happy for us. Rebecca Morrison, my best friend since college, stood next to me as maid of honor wearing the navy blue dress we'd picked out together during an afternoon of trying on options and laughing in dressing rooms. Rebecca had been in my life for over a decade by then. We'd met during sophomore year at Boston University, bonded over a terrible economics professor and a shared love of old movies. She'd been there through my mother's death, sitting with me during those first horrible weeks when grief felt like drowning. She helped me move into my first apartment after graduation, carrying boxes up 4 flights of stairs and making jokes about how much stuff I'd accumulated. Every week for years, she came over for what we called Wine Wednesday, sitting on my couch and talking about everything. Work frustrations, her latest dating disasters, my concerns about whether David and I were as happy as we appeared to be. She listened with what seemed like genuine sympathy, nodding in all the right places, saying things like, "All marriages go through adjustments, and you two just need to reconnect." I believed her because questioning your best friend feels like questioning reality itself. If you can't trust the person who's been beside you through every major life event for over a decade, then who can you trust? David worked as an investment consultant, or that's what he told me. His schedule was irregular in ways that seemed normal for someone in his field. Late nights finishing proposals, weekend trips to meet clients in New York or Chicago, conference calls at odd hours with West Coast investors. He'd come home exhausted, kiss my forehead, heat up whatever leftovers were in the fridge, and fall asleep on the couch with his laptop still open. I'd cover him with a blanket and feel this strange mixture of affection and loneliness, proud that he worked so hard while resenting how little time we actually spent together. I worked at Henderson Digital Solutions as a senior marketing analyst, developing social media strategies for mid-size companies and managing campaign analytics. It paid $72,000 a year plus benefits, enough for us to afford our suburban colonial and take modest vacations twice a year. My boss, Richard Henderson, was professional but distant, the kind of supervisor who complimented your work in meetings but never quite promoted you. I'd been there for 6 years, consistently receiving performance reviews that praised my reliability while somehow never translating into significant raises or advancement. But I didn't question it. I showed up every morning at 8:30, made coffee in the break room, sat at my desk with its view of the parking lot, and did my job. It felt stable, predictable, safe. But things had changed over the past year. Subtle shifts that I noticed but convinced myself were normal. David became more protective of his phone, tilting the screen away when I walked past, taking calls in the other room, setting it face down on the table during dinner. He was vaguer about his work projects, offering broad descriptions instead of the detailed stories he used to share. He picked fights over small things. The way I loaded the dishwasher, whether we needed organic vegetables, how much time I spent talking to Rebecca. That last one should have been a red flag, but he framed it as concern about codependency, about how I relied too much on her for emotional support instead of coming to him. Rebecca always had explanations that made me doubt my own instincts. Maybe he's stressed about work. Maybe you're being too sensitive. Maybe the marriage isn't in trouble and you're just looking for problems because you're afraid of being happy after losing your mother. Her words always sounded reasonable in the moment, logical enough that I'd talk myself out of trusting my gut. Looking back now from this motel room with its cigarette-stained walls and bed that squeaks with every movement, I can see how carefully they'd constructed everything. How every relationship I trusted had been performance art designed to keep me compliant and unsuspecting. But I didn't know that yet. Not sitting in my normal life 6 months ago, believing in the stability of routine and the protection of playing by rules. 6 months ago, everything shattered on a Tuesday afternoon when I came home sick from work. I'd woken up that morning feeling wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. Not physical illness exactly, but something deeper. A wrongness that sat in my chest and made it hard to breathe properly. By 10 o'clock, I was sitting at my desk, staring at campaign analytics and unable to focus. My hands felt cold. My heart kept racing for no reason I could name. I walked into Richard's office and told him I needed to go home. I expected him to make it difficult, to remind me about deadlines or question whether I was really sick. But he just looked at me with an expression I couldn't read and said, "Feel better," in a tone that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, like he already knew something I didn't. The drive home took 20 minutes through midday traffic. I kept the radio off because noise felt like too much to handle. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that I probably just had a stomach bug and anxiety was making it worse. But the dread kept growing with every block I drove. When I pulled into our driveway, I saw Rebecca's silver Honda Civic parked on the street. She had a key to our house and sometimes stopped by during the day if she had time between showing properties. It shouldn't have been strange to see her car there, but on a Tuesday afternoon when David was supposed to be at his office and Rebecca was supposed to be working, something about it felt wrong. I sat in my car for a full minute, engine still running, trying to talk myself out of the feeling in my gut. They were probably just having coffee, maybe planning a surprise for my birthday next month. I cycled through a dozen innocent explanations, each one more desperate than the last. I finally turned off the engine and walked to the front door, unlocking it as quietly as possible, though I couldn't have said why stealth felt necessary. The house was quiet when I stepped inside, not the empty kind of quiet, but the occupied kind where you can sense people are home even when you can't hear them. I stood in our living room, my work bag still over my shoulder, listening. That's when I heard laughter coming from upstairs, from our bedroom. Rebecca's laugh, not her normal laugh, but something different, more intimate. The kind of laugh that's meant for someone specific, designed to make that person feel special and desired. I crossed the living room, each step feeling like it took an hour, and climbed the stairs to our bedroom. I didn't knock. Why would I knock on my own bedroom door? I just turned the handle and pushed it open. David and Rebecca were in my bed, tangled in the gray sheets I'd washed 3 days earlier, looking at each other with the kind of familiarity that doesn't develop in an afternoon or even a week. This was routine for them, comfortable territory, something they'd done enough times that the mechanics had become smooth and automatic. When they saw me standing in the doorway, the first emotion on Rebecca's face wasn't shame or guilt. It was annoyance. Like I was the one interrupting something important rather than discovering that my husband and best friend had been systematically betraying me. David got out of bed and pulled on his jeans with the kind of practiced efficiency that told me this wasn't the first time he'd had to get dressed quickly. He looked at me with an expression that was worse than guilt would have been. It was impatience mixed with relief, like this confrontation was an inconvenience, but also something he'd been waiting for because pretending had gotten tiresome. "Carolyn," he said in that calm voice he used when he thought I was being unreasonable. "We need to talk about this, like adults." The absurdity of that statement almost made me laugh. But he stood there trying to gaslight me into questioning my own eyes, like I was the one creating a problem by refusing to accept his reframing of reality. Rebecca sat up, holding the sheet around herself with a modesty that would have been funny if it hadn't been so insulting. "We didn't want you to find out this way," she said, looking at me with something close to pity. "But honestly, Carolyn, this has been coming for a long time. You had to know things weren't working between you two." The presumption in that statement stole my breath. Not just that she'd been sleeping with David, but that she thought I should have known, that this was somehow predictable or even my fault for not noticing sooner. "How long?" I asked. My voice sounded strange to me, too calm, too detached. "Does it matter?" David said. "Long enough that we're sure about this. Long enough that pretending became harder than being honest." That word, pretending, it cut through me worse than any of the rest of it. How long had he been pretending to love me? How long had every kiss been performance? And how long had Rebecca been sitting on my couch drinking my wine, listening to me talk about my marriage problems, offering advice designed to keep me compliant while she was sleeping with my husband the rest of the week? I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't throw things or make a scene. I just turned around, walked to our bedroom closet, and started throwing clothes into the duffel bag I kept on the top shelf. My laptop, chargers, toiletries, the practical things you need when your life implodes in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon. David followed me, still shirtless, still trying to have the adult conversation he'd mentioned. I left without saying another word, walked out of the house I'd helped pay for, drove to a coffee shop parking lot 3 miles away, and sat in my car, crying until I couldn't breathe properly. Then I called my cousin Emma and asked if I could sleep on her couch for a few days while I figured out what to do next. She said yes, and I drove to her apartment thinking the worst was over, not understanding that the worst was just beginning. I'd been staying with Emma for 5 days when Richard called and asked me to come to his office first thing Monday morning. His voice had that careful tone people use when they're about to deliver bad news and want to seem compassionate about it. I showed up at 8:15 wearing clothes I'd ironed using Emma's board because I wanted to look professional even though I felt like I was barely holding myself together. Richard's office door was open, and he waved me in with an expression that might have been sympathy or might have been satisfaction hidden behind a professional mask. "Carolyn," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk, "I need to talk to you about some changes happening in the department." I sat down, my hands folded in my lap, trying to keep my face neutral while my stomach dropped. "We're restructuring the marketing department due to budget constraints," he said, using that careful corporate language designed to sound official and impersonal. "Unfortunately, your position is being eliminated. We're offering a severance package that should help with the transition." He slid a folder across his desk toward me. I didn't touch it. I just stared at him, trying to process what he was saying while my brain screamed that this couldn't be happening. "Budget constraints," I repeated. "We just signed 4 new clients last month. I've seen the quarterly reports. We're exceeding revenue targets. These decisions are made at levels above my control," he said. "I'm sorry, but the decision is final. I wanted to ask if this had anything to do with David, if maybe Richard had heard about the separation and decided I was too much of a liability." But something in his face stopped me, a flicker of discomfort that suggested asking questions wouldn't change anything. I took the folder, packed up my desk in 20 minutes, and walked out of Henderson Digital Solutions with a cardboard box and a severance package that barely covered 2 months of rent. Later, much later, I discovered that Richard and David had been roommates in college, that my job had never been as secure as I'd believed, that it had always been conditional on remaining useful to people whose agendas I didn't understand, The divorce proceedings started 2 weeks after I lost my job. David hired a shark of an attorney named Elizabeth Parker, a woman with a reputation for winning cases through procedural aggression. My attorney was court-appointed, a tired man named Gerald Ross who seemed to have given up on believing in justice somewhere during his career. The judge presiding over our case was Patricia Morrison, a woman in her early 50s with an efficient way of moving through her docket that suggested she'd already made her decisions before hearing any testimony. Every motion Elizabeth filed, Judge Morrison approved. Every request Gerald made on my behalf, the judge denied with barely a glance. David kept our house because his name was listed first on the deed, even though I'd contributed equally to the down payment and mortgage payments for 5 years. He kept our car because I'd missed 2 payments during the chaos following my job loss. He kept the furniture, the savings account, the retirement funds I'd contributed to for years. The settlement left me with my clothing, my laptop, and barely enough money to cover 3 months of rent at any apartment I could actually afford. The worst part wasn't losing the possessions or even the financial devastation. It was watching Rebecca take the stand as a character witness against me. She wore a tailored gray suit that I recognized immediately. We'd picked it out together 2 years earlier, and I'd told her it made her look professional and confident. Now she was wearing it to testify against me. She sat in the witness stand with perfect posture and lied with the kind of conviction that comes from practice. She told Judge Morrison that I'd been unstable for months, that I'd made concerning comments about self-harm, that I'd become increasingly paranoid and difficult to be around. None of it was true, not a single word. But Rebecca delivered each lie with perfect emotional calibration, her voice breaking slightly at the right moments, her expression showing concern mixed with reluctance. When Gerald tried to cross-examine her about her relationship with David, Elizabeth objected before he could finish the question. The judge sustained it immediately, cutting off any line of inquiry that might reveal when the affair had actually started. I sat at the defendant's table watching my best friend of over a decade systematically destroy what was left of my credibility, and I understood that this had been coordinated. The affair, the job loss, the divorce proceedings, all of it timed and executed with precision. After the divorce finalized, I had nowhere to go. Emma let me stay another week before her husband started making pointed comments about how I needed to get my life together. I cycled through friends' couches. My former colleague Diane offered her spare room for 10 days, then decided my presence was bringing negative energy into her space. Another friend let me stay for 5 days before her roommate complained. Everyone was sympathetic right up until sympathy became inconvenient, right up until supporting me required actual sustained sacrifice rather than just kind words and temporary gestures. When I finally scraped together enough money from freelance work to pay for a weekly rate at the Riverside Motel, it felt less like hitting rock bottom and more like finally finding ground that wouldn't shift beneath me. Room 22 became my address, my home, the place where I'd eventually find a box containing $90,000 and a note that explained why my destruction had been so systematic and so complete. I'd been living in room 22 for 3 weeks when I found the box under the bed. I only discovered it because I dropped my phone charger and it rolled under the bed frame. I got down on my hands and knees to retrieve it, reaching into the dusty space, and my hand hit something solid. I pulled it out into the light. An old wooden box, maybe 12 inches by 18 inches, with brass hinges that had oxidized to a dull green. It looked like something from another era, the kind of container people used before everything became plastic and disposable. A note was taped to the top with my name written in handwriting I would have recognized anywhere. Carolyn Marie Brennan Campbell. the precise, careful script of my Aunt Margaret. I sat on the floor holding the box, trying to make sense of how it had gotten there. Margaret had died 8 months ago. I'd attended her funeral, stood at her graveside, watched them lower her casket into the ground. How had her box ended up under my bed in a motel room I'd only been living in for 3 weeks? Had she somehow known I'd end up here? Had she left it with Rita at the front desk with instructions to put it in whatever room I rented? The logistics seemed impossible, but the evidence was right in front of me. The box wasn't locked. I lifted the lid with shaking hands and stared at what was inside. Cash, bundled in rubber bands, mostly $100 bills with some 50s mixed in. I counted it twice to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. $90,000. Underneath the money was a plane ticket printed on paper that had started to yellow slightly. Dublin, Ireland. Departure date 4 days from now, one way. And underneath the ticket was a note handwritten on yellow legal paper in Margaret's distinctive script. Carolyn, this is just emergency money. The real fortune is waiting where your mother's truth is buried. Don't trust David Campbell. Don't trust Rebecca Morrison. They've been planning your destruction since before your wedding. Your mother discovered fraud at Westbridge Capital. They killed her to protect billions in stolen pension funds. David was planted in your life to monitor whether Eleanor had shared information with you. Rebecca was assigned to you after Eleanor's death to ensure your isolation. I've spent 7 years collecting evidence. Everything you need is in safety deposit box, 417 at Bank of Ireland, Galway branch. The key is taped inside this box lid. Password is your mother's employee number at Westbridge. You have 2 choices. Take this money and disappear. Change your identity, start over somewhere they'll never find you, or use what I've left you to fight back and destroy the people who murdered your mother and stole your life. Either way, you'll have resources. Either way, I love you, but only one choice lets you sleep at night. Finish what your mother started before they silenced her. The truth matters more than safety. Your Aunt Margaret. I read those words 3 times, each reading making them feel more impossible and more true at the same time. My mother hadn't died in a sailing accident. She'd been murdered because she discovered fraud. David hadn't met me by chance at a conference. He'd been positioned in my life deliberately. Rebecca hadn't been my friend. She'd been my surveillance. Every moment of intimacy, every declaration of love, every Thursday wine night had been performance art in service of something I was only now beginning to understand. I found the key taped inside the box lid exactly where Margaret said it would be. A small brass key with a number engraved on it. 417. I spent that night unable to sleep, staring at the money in the note, trying to decide what to do. By morning, I'd made my choice. I wasn't running. I was done being the person things happened to. I was done disappearing while the people who destroyed my life got to move forward without consequences. I used some of Margaret's cash to pay the motel through the end of the month. I booked the flight to Dublin. I left my regular phone behind in the room, turned off, and bought a burner phone from a convenience store. Then I did something that surprised me. I drove to Margaret's old house. She'd lived alone in a small ranch-style place in a quiet neighborhood, and after she died, the property had sat empty while the estate went through probate. I still had the key she'd given me years ago, back when I used to check on her house when she traveled. The interior was exactly as I remembered. Books everywhere, stacked on shelves and piled on tables, filing cabinets in the living room where most people would have put furniture, papers organized in boxes with labels written in Margaret's handwriting. But I wasn't there for the house. Margaret's note had mentioned she'd spent 7 years collecting evidence, and if I knew my aunt, She wouldn't have trusted everything to a single safety deposit box in Ireland. She'd have backup systems, redundancies, insurance against failure. I searched for 2 hours before I found it. A key taped inside a coffee canister in the kitchen, labeled with just 2 words, storage unit. The storage facility was across town, one of those places with rows of identical garage doors and a keypad entry system. The key had a unit number on it, 342. I drove there that afternoon and used Margaret's key to open the lock. Inside was everything. Filing cabinets organized by year, boxes indexed with precise labels, a laptop computer still plugged into a power strip, a cassette player with stacks of old tapes, and photographs protected in clear plastic sleeves arranged on a folding table. The first photograph I picked up made my hands start shaking. My mother Eleanor standing between David and Rebecca at what was clearly some kind of corporate event. All 3 of them wearing name tags and business casual clothing, smiling at the camera like colleagues who knew each other well. The banner in the background said, Westbridge Capital Annual Research Summit. The date printed on the bottom of the photo was 8 years ago, 2 full years before I'd supposedly met David by chance at a marketing conference. I stared at that photograph, my brain trying to construct explanations that would let me hold on to any part of the narrative I'd believed about my own life. But I knew better. This wasn't coincidence. David hadn't met me by accident. He'd been positioned in my life deliberately, cultivated as a relationship by people who needed access to my mother. I'd been a target before I'd been a girlfriend, a mark before I'd been a wife. I set down the photograph and reached for the cassette player. The tapes were labeled in Margaret's handwriting with dates, names, and descriptions. I picked up the first one, David Campbell and Thomas Westbridge, March 2019. Discussion of Eleanor Campbell investigation status. I loaded the tape and pressed play. The voice that came through the speakers belonged to David. That voice I'd heard every day for 7 years. That voice that had told me he loved me and made promises about our future. Eleanor's getting too close, David said, his tone businesslike and emotionless. She's made copies of the trial data, and she's been meeting with someone at the FDA. I don't know who yet, but I'm working on finding out through Carolyn. A second voice responded, older and more authoritative. That must be Thomas Westbridge, the CEO. We can't let this go public. The pension fund manipulations are worth billions. If she exposes what we've done, we're looking at criminal charges and the complete dissolution of the company. Can you contain her through the daughter? I've tried, David said. But Eleanor doesn't discuss work details with Carolyn. She's protective, thinks she's keeping her daughter safe by not involving her. It's actually making my job harder because Carolyn doesn't know anything useful. Then we need to consider other options, Thomas said. Something in his tone made my blood run cold. More permanent solutions. We can't risk everything because one compliance officer developed a conscience. I paused the tape because I couldn't breathe properly. They were discussing killing my mother, planning it like it was a business decision, weighing options and considering strategies. And David, the man I'd married, was part of that conversation. I forced myself to press play again. There are ways to make it look accidental, Thomas continued. Car accidents happen. Boating accidents happen. Nobody questions those, especially when the victim has a history of taking risks. What about afterward? David asked. If Eleanor dies, Carolyn's going to be devastated. She'll lean on me for support, which gives me access. But there's also that aunt, Margaret Brennan. She's paranoid and suspicious. If Eleanor dies, Margaret's going to start asking questions. Let her ask, Thomas said dismissively. Nobody takes Margaret seriously. She's been crying wolf about corporate corruption for decades. If she starts claiming Eleanor's death wasn't an accident, people will just think she's being paranoid again. The key is making sure there's nothing concrete for her to find. The recording continued for another 20 minutes, detailing logistics I couldn't bear to hear. When it ended, I sat in the silence of Margaret's storage unit, trying to process what I'd just learned. David hadn't just been having an affair. He'd been planted in my life to monitor my mother. He'd courted me, proposed to me, married me, all as part of a strategy to gain access to information. And when that didn't work, they'd killed her. I found more tapes, recordings of Rebecca talking to someone named Patricia Morrison, discussing how to keep me isolated and manageable after Eleanor's death. More recordings of Thomas Westbridge instructing employees to manipulate pension fund data, to falsify investment returns, to steal from thousands of people who'd trusted Westbridge Capital with their retirement savings. I don't know how long I sat in that storage unit listening to recordings and reading documents. Hours, maybe. Long enough that my back ached and my eyes burned. Finally, I found the laptop Margaret had left. A note attached to the screen said, "Play this first," with an arrow pointing to a video file on the desktop labeled "For Carolyn." I opened the file and Margaret's face filled the screen. She looked exactly like I remembered from the last time I'd seen her, though visibly ill. Her face was drawn, her hands shook slightly, but her eyes were sharp and focused. "Carolyn," she began, her voice steady despite the physical deterioration. "If you're watching this, it means I'm dead, and you found my storage unit, which means you're probably angry and confused and wondering why I didn't tell you any of this while I was alive." She paused to take a sip of water from a bottle sitting off camera. "The answer is that I tried. I warned you about David at your engagement party. I pulled you aside and told you to be careful, that something about him felt wrong. You thought I was being paranoid, and I don't blame you for that. I'd spent decades being the family member everyone described as difficult. By the time I tried to warn you, you'd already learned to dismiss everything I said." Margaret adjusted the camera slightly. "Your mother was my best friend long before she was your mother. When she discovered what Westbridge was doing, she came to me because she knew I'd help her document everything properly. We spent months building a case. Then she died in that convenient accident, and I knew exactly what had happened, even though I couldn't prove it yet." She coughed, covering her mouth with a tissue. "I've spent the last 7 years collecting the evidence you're sitting with right now. I did it because I loved your mother, and because I love you, because I couldn't let them get away with killing Eleanor and destroying your life without consequences." Margaret looked directly at the camera. "You have 2 choices, Carolyn. You can take the money and disappear. Live comfortably and safely and never look back. Nobody would blame you. Or you can fight. Use everything I've collected and burn these people down. It won't be easy. They have money, lawyers, connections. But if you fight, you might actually win." She smiled then. That crooked smile I remembered from childhood. "Either way, you'll have a story worth telling. Your mother would be proud of you no matter what you choose. But I think we both know which choice lets you sleep at night." Margaret reached for something off camera. "Oh, and there's one more thing. Bank of Ireland, Galway branch. Safety deposit box 417. Password is your mother's employee number from Westbridge. That's the real fortune. The 90,000 is just travel money. Use what's in that box to fight or use it to run. But for God's sake, use it." The video ended with Margaret reaching toward the camera, and then the screen went black. I sat staring at the laptop for a long time. Then I pulled out my burner phone and booked a flight to Ireland for 2 days from now. I wasn't running. I was going to collect what Margaret had left me, and then I was coming back to destroy every single person who'd murdered my mother and stolen 7 years of my life. The flight to Dublin took 7 hours, and I spent every minute of it cycling through everything I'd learned from Margaret's storage unit. I'd copied files onto a thumb drive, backed them up to a cloud service under a fake email address, and memorized key details in case everything else was somehow compromised. I landed at Dublin Airport on a gray morning with rain that felt different from rain back home. Colder, heavier. I took a bus to Galway, watching the Irish countryside roll past the windows while my mind worked through strategies and contingencies. Bank of Ireland in Galway was a solid stone building that looked like it had been there for 100 years. I walked in with Margaret's key and my mother's employee number, written on a piece of paper I'd memorized and then burned. The bank manager, a woman named Siobhan with kind eyes and a thick accent, led me to the vault after verifying my identity. Safety deposit box 417 was larger than I'd expected, maybe 2 feet by 3 feet. She left me alone in a private viewing room with the box. Inside was everything Margaret had promised and more. Cash in euros and dollars, approximately 900,000 in various currencies. Legal documents establishing a trust in my name, funded by Margaret's life savings and designed to protect the assets from any legal challenges. Stock certificates, bearer bonds, real estate deeds. But more importantly, there was evidence. My mother's complete forensic analysis of Westbridge Capital's pension fund fraud. Detailed documentation showing how Thomas Westbridge and his executives had systematically stolen $47 million from retirement accounts over the past decade. Lists of victims whose savings had been decimated. Emails proving they knew exactly what they were doing. And at the bottom of the box, a letter from my mother addressed to me, written just 2 weeks before she died. My dearest Carolyn, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and Margaret was able to get these materials to you. I'm so sorry I couldn't tell you about any of this while I was alive. I thought keeping you separate from my investigation would keep you safe. I was wrong. The people at Westbridge Capital are dangerous. They've threatened me, followed me, made it clear they'll do whatever necessary to protect their fraud. I've made copies of everything and given them to Margaret for safekeeping. If something happens to me, use this evidence to destroy them. Don't let them get away with stealing from thousands of innocent people. Be careful who you trust. Be smarter than I was, and know that I love you more than anything in this world. You are the best thing I ever did. Make them pay, sweetheart. Make them pay for all of it. Your mother, Eleanor. I sat in that bank vault and cried for the first time since finding David and Rebecca in my bed. Not sad tears exactly, but tears of rage and determination and grief for the mother I'd lost and the 7 years they'd stolen from me. Then I pulled out my burner phone and called the number Margaret had left in her files. Agent William Torres, FBI Financial Crimes Division. He answered on the 3rd ring. Torres. "My name is Carolyn Campbell," I said. "My Aunt Margaret Brennan left me information about a case I think you've been trying to build about Westbridge Capital." The silence lasted long enough that I checked the phone to make sure the call hadn't dropped. "Where are you right now?" he asked. His tone completely changed. "Galway, Ireland. At a bank. I have everything. Documents, recordings, forensic analysis of the pension fund fraud. My mother, Eleanor Campbell, was the compliance officer who discovered it. They killed her 7 years ago." "Don't move," Torres said. "Don't talk to anyone else. I'm getting on a plane tonight. I'll be there in 14 hours. Wait for me." The next 2 days moved with the kind of focused intensity that comes from finally understanding exactly what needs to be done. Agent Torres arrived in Galway with 2 other agents and spent 12 hours reviewing everything Margaret had collected. He confirmed what I already knew. This was enough to open a federal investigation. We're talking conspiracy charges, fraud, possibly murder if we can prove the boating accident was arranged, Torres said. Carolyn, you just handed me a case that could take down a major investment firm. I negotiated carefully. I wanted immunity for full cooperation. I wanted witness protection if it became necessary. I wanted assurance that David, Rebecca, Thomas Westbridge, and everyone involved would face maximum consequences. Torres agreed to all of it. 3 weeks later, I was back in the United States, staying in a safe house while Torres and his team built their case. They moved with bureaucratic thoroughness that he assured me was necessary when prosecuting corporations with billions in assets. Subpoenas were drafted and approved. Bank accounts were frozen. Former Westbridge employees who'd been fired for asking questions were interviewed and suddenly felt safe enough to share what they'd witnessed. And then Torres made his move. On a Wednesday morning in early spring, federal agents raided Westbridge Capital headquarters. I watched the footage on the news from my safe house, seeing employees standing in the parking lot looking confused while agents carried boxes out of the gleaming glass building. Thomas Westbridge was arrested at his home that afternoon. The news cameras caught footage of him being led out in handcuffs, past his neighbors and reporters shouting questions he didn't answer. David was arrested 2 days later at his office. I watched the local news footage, rewinding it multiple times because apparently I developed unhealthy coping mechanisms around witnessing karma manifest in handcuffs. He maintained his composure, walked with his head up, but I could see fear in his eyes mixed with disbelief. Rebecca was arrested at her real estate office in Seattle, where she'd moved after the divorce. According to the news reports, she cried during her arrest. The tears felt performative, given that she'd testified against me without showing genuine emotion. Then came the news about Judge Patricia Morrison. She resigned from the bench with a statement about wanting to spend more time with family, which is what corrupt officials say when they're hoping resignation will prevent prosecution. It didn't work. She was indicted 3 weeks later for accepting bribes and manipulating court proceedings. Documents Margaret had collected showed she'd purchased property through a trust that traced back to Westbridge Capital. She'd been ruling in favor of corporate interests for years in exchange for payments disguised as consulting fees. Every case she'd presided over was reviewed. My divorce case was among the first to be vacated, erased like it had never happened. Torres called me the day the review was completed. Your marriage to David is being annulled rather than finalized as a divorce. The courts are declaring it invalid from the beginning due to fraud. You're also getting a formal apology from the judicial system, for whatever that's worth. It was worth something. Not enough to undo the damage, but something. The formal apology arrived as a letter on official court stationery, acknowledging that I'd been subjected to proceedings fundamentally compromised by corruption. I read it once and filed it away with all the other documents that marked the destruction and rebuilding of my life. 6 weeks after the arrests, the divorce settlement was completely overturned. A new judge awarded me half the value of everything David and I had acquired during the marriage, plus damages for fraud and emotional distress. The amount came to $8.5 million once David's Westbridge payments and hidden assets were factored in. But the real victory came when I testified at the preliminary hearings. I walked into that courtroom and looked directly at David, at Rebecca, at Thomas Westbridge sitting at their respective defense tables, and I spoke clearly and calmly about everything they'd done. I described finding David and Rebecca in my bed. I detailed losing my job and my home. I explained about the motel room and the box Margaret had left. I played recordings of them discussing my mother's murder. I presented documents showing the systematic fraud. When I finished, David looked at me across the courtroom with an expression somewhere between anger and resignation, like he couldn't quite believe the woman he'd married as part of a surveillance operation had been the one to bring the evidence that destroyed him. I looked back without blinking, without emotion, because I was done being intimidated by people who'd systematically underestimated what I was capable of when pushed far enough. The story went viral within days. Journalists picked it up, and suddenly I was doing interviews about corporate fraud and surviving systematic betrayal. Social media exploded with hashtags. Justice for Carolyn started trending. Victims of Westbridge's fraud came forward with their own stories. David's other relationships were exposed. Turned out I wasn't his first surveillance target, just the most significant. Rebecca's real estate deals were investigated and revealed as money laundering operations. The public opinion shifted completely, and I became a symbol of resilience whether I wanted to be or not. Thomas Westbridge's trial came first. It became a media spectacle that dominated news for weeks. Whistleblowers testified about the culture of fraud at Westbridge. Victims who'd lost their retirement savings shared their stories. Forensic accountants explained money trails connecting executive bonuses to stolen pension funds. The jury deliberated for 6 days before returning guilty verdicts on 17 counts. The judge sentenced Thomas Westbridge to 35 years in federal prison and forfeiture of $40 million in assets. He was 61 years old, which meant he'd spend the rest of his life incarcerated. I watched the sentencing from the gallery sitting in the back row. When the judge finished and the bailiffs led Thomas away in handcuffs, I felt something that wasn't quite satisfaction and wasn't quite closure. It was more like watching a long equation finally balance. David's trial was smaller and quieter, but more personal. I attended every day watching prosecutors present evidence of his role in monitoring my mother, his participation in planning her murder, his 7-year marriage to me as an intelligence operation. The recordings were played in court. I listened to his voice discussing my mother like she was an obstacle. The jury returned guilty verdicts on conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, and racketeering. 15 years in federal prison. When the verdict was read, David looked at me one last time. I looked back without blinking, and something in that moment felt like finally closing a chapter I'd been trapped in for 7 years. Rebecca accepted a plea deal, 8 years in exchange for testimony against other defendants. 6 months into her sentence, I received a letter from her. 3 pages of apologies and explanations about being young and desperate for money. She asked if we could eventually forgive each other because our friendship had meant something real despite the lies. I read the letter once while drinking morning coffee in my new apartment, and I felt nothing but hollow satisfaction. The letter was self-justification dressed in remorse. She wanted absolution I wasn't willing to give. I filed it away and never responded. Some relationships can't be repaired and shouldn't be attempted. Forgiveness isn't something you owe to people who systematically destroyed your life just because they later regret getting caught. The civil lawsuit against Westbridge Capital took another 18 months to resolve. The company fought aggressively, deploying teams of lawyers to challenge every claim. But eventually, facing the weight of criminal convictions, they settled. The terms required Westbridge to pay $2.7 billion to pension fund victims. They had to fund independent safety reviews and submit to federal monitoring for 15 years. It was the largest settlement of its kind in financial fraud history. My mother's estate received $18 million in wrongful death damages. I inherited it as her only living relative, and I donated every dollar to organizations that advocate for financial transparency and whistleblower protection. The money felt tainted, earned through my mother's murder, and I already had enough resources from Margaret's trust. Instead, I used part of Margaret's trust to start the Brennan Campbell Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to investigating corporate fraud and supporting whistleblowers who risk their careers to expose misconduct. We hired investigators, funded legal defenses, published reports that made corporations uncomfortable. The foundation became my full-time work, my way of channeling grief and anger into something productive, something that would have made my mother and Margaret proud. I moved to Ireland permanently, buying a small cottage outside Galway overlooking the bay. The cottage had stone walls and a garden where I planted vegetables and flowers. It was quiet in a way that felt healing after years of chaos and betrayal. Nina Petrov, who owned a small cafe in Galway where I'd started having breakfast during my first trip, became a genuine friend. She was a former refugee who'd rebuilt her life from nothing, and she understood resilience in ways people who'd always had stability couldn't. She moved into the guest cottage on my property and helped me run the foundation's European operations. Agent Torres became a trusted advisor, helping us navigate investigations and coordinate with law enforcement agencies. James Chen, the lawyer who'd represented me pro bono during the court proceedings, joined the foundation as legal director. I found peace in a small community of genuine people who chose to be in my life rather than people assigned to me. Family gatherings with friends who showed up because they wanted to, not because they were being paid. I still think about room 22 at the Riverside Motel sometimes, about sitting on that sagging bed eating instant ramen, wondering if I'd ever climb out of the hole my life had become. I keep the receipt from my last week there in my wallet as a reminder that rock bottom is real. That humiliation and betrayal can strip away everything you thought defined you, but they can't destroy you unless you let them. Margaret had understood that. She'd spent her final years building a case because she believed truth mattered more than comfort, and justice mattered more than safety. She'd been right. The paranoid aunt everyone dismissed had been the only one who understood how the world actually worked, who recognized that powerful people don't stop being corrupt just because you trust them. At 33, I'm not the woman I was when I found that box under the motel bed. I'm stronger, more careful about trust, but also more certain about what matters. That woman didn't understand how much she could survive or how powerful she could become when everything else had been stripped away. 1 year after the trials ended, I published a memoir called The Long Game: How My Aunt Helped Me Destroy Corporate Corruption. It became a bestseller and led to speaking engagements at fraud prevention conferences. I became a mentor to other women escaping toxic relationships, sharing what I'd learned about resilience and strategic patience. I visited my mother's favorite place in Ireland, a cliff overlooking the Atlantic where we'd scattered some of her ashes years ago. I brought Margaret's final letter and read it standing in the wind. "If you're reading this here," Margaret had written, "you chose to fight. I knew you would. You're your mother's daughter, and Eleanor's revenge is you, alive, thriving, unstoppable." I stood on that cliff with a rescue dog I'd adopted and named Margaret, watching waves crash against the rocks below, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years: peace mixed with purpose. The Brennan Campbell Foundation has helped expose 12 corporate fraud cases in the past year. We've protected 43 whistleblowers from retaliation. We've recovered $86 million for victims of pension fraud schemes. David was recently denied parole. I attended the hearing remotely to ensure he stayed incarcerated. Rebecca sends letters occasionally that I don't read. Thomas Westbridge filed appeals that were denied at every level. I've started seeing someone, a bookshop owner in Galway named Liam, who makes me laugh and doesn't ask me to be anyone other than who I am. We're taking it slow because I'm still learning to trust again, but it feels different this time. It feels real. The best revenge isn't just living well. It's becoming the person they never imagined you could be, and using everything they took from you to protect others from them. My Aunt Margaret understood that. My mother understood that. And now I understand it too. They thought destroying me would silence the truth. Instead, they created someone with nothing left to lose and every reason to fight. The most dangerous person in the world isn't someone with power. It's someone who's been underestimated and has finally stopped underestimating herself. I'm Carolyn Campbell, and this is my story of how betrayal became transformation, how rock bottom became foundation, and how the systematic destruction of my life became the catalyst for destroying a corrupt empire. If this journey from betrayal to triumph moved you, hit that like button right now. What resonated most? Was it discovering Margaret's evidence, confronting the betrayers in court, or building a new life in Ireland? Share your favorite moment in the comments below, and if you know someone who needs to hear this story about resilience and justice, share it with them. Subscribe for more powerful stories about people who refuse to let betrayal define them. The best revenge is becoming unrecognizable to the people who tried to destroy you, and I've proven it's possible. Thank you for being part of this journey.